Well, this is a political story, but the military component here is important and it's downright frightening as well. That's why we've decided to ask Bradley Bowman to join us tonight. He's Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He joins us from Washington. It's good to have you back on the program, Brad. If you could explain to our audience the role of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and why it is so critical to the role of the U.S. president.
Thank you for the opportunity to join you, and thank you for the question. You know, to kind of create a complex bureaucracy and make it simple, you have each of the services. You have the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and now Space Force, and each of those has a chief of staff or that leads it. And then atop those individuals, you have a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and a vice chairman, and together they make up the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The primary role of the chairman is to advise the president. So really his primary and really sole job is to advise the president. He sits atop this massive bureaucracy. You have combatant commands, both functionally aligned and geographically aligned. We could get into all that, but the primary role of the chairman is to advise the president.
Okay, and this new book, it's generating a lot of buzz because it claims that the general took secret action to prevent former President Trump from starting a war. The general even phoned his Chinese counterpart to let him know that the U.S. was not preparing to attack. And we've got a quote from the book here. This is the general calling General Lee and saying, "You and I have known each other for 5 years now. If we're going to attack, I'm going to call you ahead of time. It's not going to be a surprise." Now, because of this, there are calls for the general to resign. And I want to ask you, Brett, you are a military man, you're a veteran, you've flown Apache helicopters, you know the mechanics as well as the politics of U.S. military policies. What's your read on what the general did?
Well, thanks for that. Yeah, I did serve in the Army. I flew Black Hawk helicopters, but also taught American politics. No problem. But I also taught American politics at West Point to cadets. And so we talked about the Constitution and their oath to that Constitution. And I also worked in the U.S. Senate for 8 or 9 years. So I feel like I have a view on this to offer. And I would start with this. There's an important principle and an important reality here that I think if we're going to want to come at this objectively and fairly, the principle is, right, the United States is a constitutional republic. And we have a long-standing element of that constitutional order that we have civilian control of the military. And military officers swear an oath when they're commissioned and often at promotion ceremonies to support and defend that constitutional order. So that's the principle that's fundamental. It goes all the way back, frankly, to George Washington, more or less. Then we also have a reality and a truth that I think we have to say regardless of where someone comes down on partisan issues. And that is that the United States just went through a massive stress test. The Trump presidency, shall we say, was unorthodox, and the presidential election and transition was a particular stress test. And during that time, you had General Milley making 2 phone calls, one on October 30th and another on January 8th, to potentially our leading threat and adversary, the People's Republic of China, our counterpart there. I would say these calls are very standard. They're very normal. This particular call, the reporting in the book is quite sensational, but some of the subsequent reporting suggests it's a little bit more kind of a normal thing. It was These calls were apparently coordinated. There was staff in the room, and then following the phone calls, it was briefed around to the entire Department of Defense and the interagency. And the Secretary of Defense at the time and then the acting Secretary of Defense were both aware of the calls. So to really understand if this was problematic and was outside legal and appropriate norms, you'd have to see the transcript. But if General Milley was simply saying, hey, we're not going to attack you anytime soon, that's the president's call, of course, but we have no plans to do that. That America, despite what it might look like on TV, is still stable, and to kind of diffuse tensions. As long as he's not criticizing the president and he's not suggesting that he's the decision maker on those issues, in my view, that would be an appropriate call.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And I'm wondering, since you have taught, do you know of any other president in U.S. history since the invention of nuclear weapons who warranted this kind of clandestine, if secret, if you will, maneuvering to protect the country and to respect the Constitution?
There's a piece by Corey Shockey over at the American Enterprise Institute just out in the last day or so where she mentions the Nixon era, where the leadership of the Pentagon at the time took some steps that one could kind of look at for some sort of comparison. I think that's probably the last time the United States went through a constitutional, if you will, stress test like this. But the bottom line is, if General Milley was making a call to his counterpart and was not in any way criticizing the president or suggesting that he was the decision maker, and was just saying, hey, we have, things are stable, we're okay here, let's keep the conversation, the lines open, that would be appropriate. So, but it's difficult for us to decisively come down on this unless we've seen the transcript. And so I think some of these calls about resignation and treason are premature and frankly irresponsible.
Yeah, well, speaking of that, the former U.S. president himself, he's calling for drastic measures to be taken against the general. Take a listen.
If it is actually true, which is hard to believe, that he would have called China and done these things and was willing to advise them of an attack or in advance of an attack, that's treason.
Does he have a point at all there, Brad?
Serious word, right? That's a word we should not use lightly. I think that's reckless to use that word, especially before we have all the facts. The former president sounds like he may or may not be aware that these calls happen all the time. It really depends what he was said, and the subsequent reporting suggests this was more in the norm. But a larger point, if I may, because of the stress test that the United States has gone through, a lot of hopes and expectations have been put on the U.S. military, really kind of an extraordinary way to protect our constitutional order. I think what Americans need to understand is if we're going to perpetuate this wonderful experiment in Republican democracy and our constitutional order, we can't put all this on the U.S. military. The U.S. military is to fight and win our nation's wars, not preserve our constitutional order per se. We support and defend the Constitution, but American citizens, Congress, and civil society elements need to focus more on doing what's best for our country and putting some of the vitriolic and tribal partisanship aside. That's the real threat to our constitutional order, and I see the U.S. military just applying to play a responsible role in that. But we've got to stop putting so much expectation on the U.S. military, because sooner or later, that's going to break the military in a way that no American would want.
Well, you bring me to my next question. There's a new poll out that says 51% of Americans say that they expect their political party to try to manipulate election results in the near future if their party does not win the election. I mean, that is quite an indictment of American voters. How confident, though, are you in the military remaining apolitical if a crisis like this were to indeed happen?
I'm very confident. I saw this coming. I published a piece on Election Day talking about the dangers of our vitriolic and tribal politics. But again, I taught at West Point for 3 years, and it's deeply ingrained in the culture of the U.S. military that the civilians are in charge and that our oath is to the Constitution and not a particular individual, political party, or president, period. And so I think that's very deep. But if you continue to have this kind of level of stress on the military over the long term, rather than having this be kind of a 4 to 8 year anomaly, then I wouldn't be concerned over the long term. But I think it held in the last 4 to 6 years. It will continue to hold, but this should not be a long-term demand, because in the end, that's not the role of the U.S. military. It's to address foreign and domestic threats for sure. But you can't expect the maintenance of small L liberal, small D Democratic Republican democracy. You can't put all that on the Pentagon. If we're doing that, that's unhealthy. And over the long term, it's probably unsustainable.
And I think there are a lot of people, especially here in Europe, who hope that a stress test like you described before doesn't happen again. Bradley Bowman joining us tonight from Washington. It's always good to have you on the show, and we appreciate your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.